It's time to hand over to Antonio Loprieno, member of the jury. Antonio is Egyptologist and linguist, professor and former rector of the University of Basel and the Conférence des Universités Suisses, currently president of the European Federation of Academies of Science and Humanities and of the Swiss Academies of Arts and Science. Thank you so much, dear Antonio, to share with us now the reasons and the motivation of this choice. I thank all of you for your presence, and I wish you a very good evening.
Thank you, Cyril. Dear Johny Pitts, ladies and gentlemen, the prize we are gathered to celebrate today bears the title, as we just heard, European Essay Award. To be honest, it is not crystal clear what our founding father meant and what we mean by labeling this prize as European. It is like St. Augustine's answer to what time is. If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to a questioner, I do not know. In our jurist practice, the concept European essay rather evokes a bundle of connotations than it denotes a semantically unequivocal entity. What can the adjective European actually refer to? Hardly to the original nationality of the prize winner, who, if we look at our awards history, can equally well be of Oriental or American cultural origin. Nor can the predicate European be taken to refer to the contents of the crowned essay. Indeed, this would imply an all-encompassing understanding of this term, since the laureate's topics range from ancient Egyptian theology to modern societal challenges. In fact, we would be hard-pressed to explain what precisely we intend or exclude with this definition, all the more so since our own country frequently takes itself to represent the epitome of the European spirit, only to display reluctance to become part of, or apparently even be closely associated with, the EU, which after all is the closest approximation we have at our disposal to a socio-political understanding of what Europe may mean. But this semantic opaqueness seems to vanish when we look at this year's laureate. Indeed, if there is one book that we all consider prototypically European, that book is Johny Pitts' Afropean Notes from a Black Europe. I do not know whether you as author, dear Johny Pitts, will necessarily feel pride in receiving an official accolade of Europeanness from a country that invests a lot of energy trying to convince the rest of the world that while we are located in the center of Europe, our vocation is neutral and global. But since I was bestowed the great honor to report to you the motivation of our jury, I have to be sincere and face you with this untoward reality. Yes, in our eyes, your essay, Afropean, is so quintessentially European that it perfectly reflects the continent we long for. Simultaneously national and international, self-referential and self-ironical, Judeo-Christian and enlightened, looking for utopia and satisficing with non-dystopia, whitish but not white. In your book, you, a British journalist of Euro-Afro-American descent, analyzed the situation of Black communities in Europe as a result of both historical colonialism and postmodern diversity. European post-colonialism, particularly in the UK, is indeed a very different cultural discourse from post-colonial studies in the US. When you speak of the blurring that affects both those who consider themselves Europeans and those who do not, you verbalize, in fact, the main difference between the two approaches. In the US, this discourse always involves the expectation of a correction of past wrongdoing, what I would define as a mode of recompense. In Europe, where Black communities mostly lack iconic figures whom they can refer to, things are different. Through the lens of your encounters, you show that the sense of wrongdoing has not yet fully entered the arena of everyday politics, only now perhaps beginning to affect cultural discourse, for example, in the restitution of stolen artifacts now kept in European museums. This difference implies that it may be easier for a non-whitish European to develop a sense of ownership for the European project. Your book has this reassuring vein. It is uneasy, but possible and desirable to be a European of African extraction. It is as if you had written this book having our jury in mind, dear Johny Pitts, something that we ourselves found unlikely, especially after we realized that we were not the only jury you must have had in mind when writing this book. In a major book fair in another European country, even larger than Switzerland, one we sometimes like to refer to as a larger canton, you have been awarded a certainly less impressive prize than ours, but one that nonetheless shows that your essay has definitely struck one of our continent's chords. What impresses and moves us at the same time is also the sense of discrete decadence that you seem to recognize in contemporary Europe. You warn us subtly against the winds of nationalism that blow across our continent. Traveling through the cities of Western Europe during the winter months, you write, I got the feeling I was witnessing a slow decline, that the continent was looking backwards, dining out on a warped, sentimental view of itself. But unlike other authors, you don't just warn us, you also remind us of the common history that both unites and separates the two continents that make out the Afropean reality. Your personal observations on blackness in Europe today, the descriptions of the cities you visited, and the accounts of some of the influential people of African descent who have lived in these places help us visualize that color has always belonged to Europe. But in reminding us of this uncommon common history, you do not subscribe to the victimist agenda of post-colonial studies. You point to Europe's duplicity without delegitimizing it, thereby scoring a home run in our whitish hearts. On the one hand, you offer us stories of self-assertion, talking to the reggae singer and poet Linton Kwesi Johnson, or reconstructing the traces of anti-colonial figures like Frantz Fanon. You describe Black communities in places as diverse as Paris and Lisbon, in their negotiating diverse forms of identity in a continent that seems so emotionally accompany their quest, since Europe is itself trying to figure out what it wants to be or what it can afford to be. You talk about blackness, but also address whitishness. By doing so, while not forgetting the daily suffering of the millions of Europeans of African descent, you also give a voice to examples of individual success. Black Europeans without a hyphen, as you write in your book, without mix this, half that, or black other. Not half European, but rather both European and something else. At a time in our cultural history in which neo-romantic identities seem to triumph, we recognize in you an ally in your critical but unmistakable allegiance to the now seemingly moribund Enlightenment model, in which identity is not only something you are a recipient of, but also something you assertively help to forge. While indeed accepting the primacy of identity discourse, you in fact expand both the idea of blackness and that of British identity. Your book is therefore moderately disruptive. Moderate in the etymological sense of constant mediation between potentially polarizing positions. And moderate in another sense, since yours is neither an essay in history nor one in sociology, but rather an essay in how to reinvent this genre by letting other communicative patterns emerge. Far from being extremist, your reading of the Afropean reality evokes compromise. And you may know that there is nothing more Swiss than the concept of compromise. Your compromise is a dialectic togetherness of two continents that from the antiquity, where Africa was in the role of cultural colonizer, I am an Egyptologist, to the modern times where the roles have been switched, to the contemporary world where ethnic distinctions are being critically revisited, we have all shared a common destiny. And precisely because it challenges the victimist paradigm, your book represents a genuinely European contribution to the discourse of post-colonialism. It overcomes the binary North-South perspective of traditional post-colonial studies with their polarity of colonizers versus colonized or center versus periphery, and diversifies the emancipatory agenda. We discover that this Europe of color, if I may use this misnomer for lack of a better neologism, is in fact a mirror of the challenges our continent faces at a larger scale. The need to combine diversity and quest for unity, national or local specificities, and a sense of a common mission in the world. While the US appears to us to be torn between rebellious populism and cancel culture, and China confronts us with its improbable wish that we seek economic proximity while recognizing political abyss, the bond between sociocultural and economic liberalism now appears less tight than the tradition of the European Enlightenment had taught us to believe. Afropean helps us hope that we might still succeed. And there's the third sense in which Johny Pitts' Afropean is a moderately disruptive book. You examine the consequences of colonialism and the multicultural approach in Europe today without adhering to disciplinary boundaries. You are not a traditional scholar of texts, which makes you actually an ideal essayist of images. In describing who today's Afropeans are and how they inhabit and shape our continent, in traveling through many European cities, you don't write texts. You rather paint pictures. And a look at the emergence of smileys in our alphabetic script should suffice to convince us that images are more proximal carriers of emotional load than textual knowledge, doomed to remain distal. In the descriptions of European cities, in all their contradictions, the visual nature of your narrative becomes particularly distinct. Faithful to your professional origin, you are more a cineast than a writer. The iconic nature of your prose is the reasons for your essay's success. You convince us precisely because you are a traveler, not only between places, but also between academic conventions. I found your grasp of the dynamics of ethnicity and politics in Berlin is a particular highlight. While observing that one of the most prototypical bastions of white culture has generated one of Europe's most interesting hubs of Black culture, you also note how the leftist movements could do much more to be inclusive of Black people. And you are always prudent enough to explore precarious situations, but you refuse to draw neat conclusions. Also, you have the good sense not to examine the role of faith within Afropean life. In an era where Islam is under the political microscope more than ever, what would be taken as an omission on your part is in fact a divine blessing because, and this is another sign of your critical renegotiations of so-called identities, there are indeed more relevant differences than religion in shaping European diversity. You remind us, for example, of the major differences between British and French culture in dealing with ethnic otherness. As a legacy of the cultural diversity of the British Empire, Blacks in England are more confident than those in mainland Europe. We are very much not a racist family, as Prince William's recently put it in a vivid way. This aspect is missing in France, Germany, or Italy, where Republican ideology cannot easily come to terms with a plurality of allegiance. Today, we are especially delighted to bring Johny Pitts alongside our 1999 laureate, Amin Maalouf, whose Identité meurtrière Johny Pitts places at the beginning of his essay. In the spirit of Amin Maalouf, he describes a reality to be seen in witnesses, life paths based on tolerance and respect for the other, worlds whose histories intersect and cross-fertilize without the parties always knowing or recognizing each other. We celebrate Afropean as your personal journey, the scene upon which you stage your play, but we also celebrate it as a proxy for our hope to navigate the path to Europe's uncertain future. Our jury is very honored to unanimously award you the 43rd European Essay Award. Thank you very much.